Okay, I'm gonna start. So, can everyone hear me? Can you give me a thumbs up on an emoji if you can hear me clearly? Okay, great. Okay, so today I'm gonna be covering Rhino, the general interface and organic modeling on Rhino. So, just to preface, the thing about software is that you can never learn it all in one go, right? There's just too many things to cover. So I'm just here to introduce you to the software and introduce you to how to organic model and the theory behind organic modeling in Rhino. And you have to do a lot of the learning on your own. So a lot of the times it's like you need to model something specific and then you have to search up tutorials to model that specific thing. So I hope all of you have downloaded Rhino and Grasshopper for tomorrow's tutorial in the morning. And Rhino and Grasshopper work in tandem, so you're gonna need both for the next exercise. And make sure you have a good computer. If you need to know which computer to use, ask your TAs. And also, you need a mouse. Don't make the mistake of not using a mouse. But yeah, okay, so I'll just get straight into it. So the difference between Rhino and all other modeling software is that in Rhino, you're able to model directly in 3D and it's you can model organic shapes. So if you just do a simple Google search of Rhino modeling, you can clearly see a lot of, funky, weird shapes that you can model. But then if I look into, those poly people that use SketchUp and Revit, it's very planar and it's not directly 3D. It's like, a 2D form extruded into a 3D. So that's why we want you guys to try out Rhino. Okay, and then I'm just gonna cover a bit of theory about organic modeling or parametric modeling. So essentially, right, there are three types of organic modeling. The first is NURBS. Okay, so NURBS is like the default, which are non-uniform rational B-splines modeling. Yep. Okay, I'm gonna continue if there's no problem. Um, so sorry, can you guys hear me? Is there an issue?
Let me see how many people are there.
Sorry, Ti Tiao, do you mind muting yourself, please? Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna continue. So number one is NURBS. So NURBS is the default, and I will go into it more in depth while I'm doing the tutorial. But I just want to preface this before we get into it so that you know kind of what you're doing. So essentially, what NURBS is that instead of a uniform plane which has uniform splines running through it, you can actually modify the splines. So each spline can go a different direction, and that's how you are able to get organic shape. So these are some examples of how these splines don't run, uniformly throughout the entire plane. So if I had a flat plane, right, I would just have straight lines at equidistant from each other running across. But in this case, I don't. And that's how I'm able to get these, undulating shapes or organic shapes. So that's number one. And under NURBS, we'll learn about lofting and rebuilding, which I'll get into later on. So the next type of organic modeling is a mesh. So essentially what mesh is that an object's shape is defined by a collection of uniform faces, edges, and vertices that are connected to one another. So a NURBS object that is split into a mesh is split into multiple planar uniform faces. And these faces can be adjusted individually. So what mesh allows you to do is allow you to adjust sub-objects, which is the subplanes within each overall shape. So under this, we'll cover mesh tools and sub-object selection via filter. So what mesh looks like is this. So essentially, if I have a NURBS shape, right, and I mesh it, I'm gonna get these little polygons that are planar, but there's so many of them that it forms a somewhat organic shape, you know what I mean? So the more times I mesh, the more clear my shape will be. And if it's lesser meshes, it will be more arbitrary. So in Rhino, you can control the amount of planes that you want in your mesh. So the same for this. So like if you see this object, so the center would be like fewer meshes, and then on the left is sorry, the left would be fewer meshes, and then it goes to more meshes. So then the object is more defined. So that is mesh. And then we have the third one, which is subdivision, sub D. So sub D is essentially mesh, but instead of uniform faces, you have non-uniform faces. So everything is essentially smoothened out. So again, it's the same thing, and each face can be adjusted individually, but just that instead of uniform faces and the hard edges, you have rounded edges because each plane is non-uniform. So under this, there's sub D tools, and then again, you can adjust sub-objects via the filter. So sub D would look like this. So if you look at this image, right, the top is mesh. So fewer meshes to a lot of meshes, and each of these little squares can be controlled individually. But then when I go to sub D, these like planar faces become non-uniform and non-planar. They become 3D. So each plane is already 3D to begin with. And then if I add more faces, my object will be more defined. So it's kind of like opposite of mesh, kind of. But the whole point of mesh and sub-D is that you can control each object individually. So this is like another example. And you can see the difference. So if I look at this image, essentially the middle would be NURBS, the left would be mesh, and the right would be subdivision. Okay? So between these three, you can actually convert. So if I model an object in NURBS, I can use the mesh command in Rhino. Like I just type mesh, and then it will mesh my object, and I can control the number of faces that I want in my mesh. And then from mesh, I can also convert to sub D, where my mesh with the hard edges becomes an object with soft edges and more organic, right? And then from sub D, I can also convert to NURBS, and mesh also convert to NURBS. So the command would be to NURBS. Okay, so this might be a bit confusing for now, but while I cover the Rhino tutorial, I think you will understand better. And if you don't, you can ask questions. Okay, so now I'm gonna open Rhino and start off with the interface. So when you first open Rhino, you can see like some of your recent models, or you can like start a new model with different units, but usually we work in or meters, depending on what you prefer. So, okay, so first what I want to cover is the viewports. So obviously there is 4 viewports. There's one top view, front view, right view, and perspective view. And if I, for example, draw a box, right? Then in the top view, the front view, and the right view, I'll be able to see essentially, so the right view is this side, then the top view is this side, and the front view is this side. So it's 2D except the perspective version. So except the perspective viewport, and I can double click into each viewport to expand it. So usually I like to work with perspective, or I'll expand the perspective window like this, you know, and then work with multiple viewports. And another thing is that you can change how the viewport looks using this setting. So there's this drop down setting, and you can change into like wireframe, which is showing the wires, and then like shaded view or a rendered view, which takes a longer time to process. X-ray and like ghosted, you can see like the internal parts. But yeah, so usually when we model, because sometimes our models get very complicated, so we like to work in different views. So if you want to zoom in, zoom out, you can just scroll in and out. And then if you hold shift, you can, you know, move like this. hold shift and hold your right mouse. And then, yeah, if you control shift, you can like pan the view. And then you can zoom in and zoom out by just scrolling in and out. Okay, so that's the basic understanding of what the interface is. Next, I'm gonna go into layers. Okay, so for layers, right, what you can do is, for example, I have this one curve and this one object. I can add a new layer and assign these objects into different layers. So what this helps with is that when your model gets very complicated, then you can put different objects in different layers. And usually we name layers like walls or floor or something like that, so that we can turn off and on these layers easily. So for example, I put this object and I go into properties of the object and I assign it layer 1. And then I click on this object and I assign this object layer 2, right? And I can also change the color, the display color of these layers. So I want this in red and this in blue, for example. So now I know which object is in which layer. And then when I turn this light bulb off and on, I can control what I'm seeing, essentially. And I can also lock objects. So when I lock a layer, I can't move this object anymore. So then I can work on it without, accidentally moving it around. So that's the purpose, essentially, of layers. You can also use layers to change materials of like one entire layer. So sometimes you can like assign layers based on what materials you want. So if you want to change materials, you can go into this and then play around with these options. I won't go super detailed into it. Okay, and then for selection, so again, now I'm just gonna make random squares. So for selection, right, if I go from top to bottom, I select everything on my screen. So everything within or intersecting with this box. But if I go from bottom to top, sorry, my bad, opposite. So if I go from bottom to top, I'm selecting everything that is intersecting or inside this box. And if I go from top to bottom, I'm only selecting anything that is inside the box. Do you know what I mean? So like if this object, the one on the left is entirely inside the box, it will get selected, and then the one on the right will not be selected. But then if I go the opposite way, everything will be selected. Yeah, so that's with selection. What else? Okay, so there's this super important tool called Gumball. So again, I'll draw a box. And when I click the box, you see this thing pop up, right? So this thing is called Gumball, and the settings for Gumball is at the bottom here. So if I click and unclick this, it will turn on and off. And if I right click on this, I'll get Gumball options. So I can align this Gumball to the C plane, which is the grid on the bottom, or to the object, and I can change like the different settings for the Gumball. Okay, so what Gumball does is that it allows me to move the object. So I can either drag it along the X, Y, and Z, or if I want to move it by a specific amount, like for example, I want to move it up by 1 meter. So I'll just move it up by 1,000, and it's now floating up in the air, right? If I want to move it downwards instead of upwards, all I need to do is add a negative. So what this works on is the XYZ plane. So if I'm moving it 1,000 up, I'm moving it 1,000 up the Z axis, right? And then negative 1,000 down the Z axis. So if I move it by negative 20, then it will move downwards instead of upwards. And the same for all three of these arrows. And what I can also do is scale. So if I click this little box here, right? And I press 2, for example. I can scale it by this one direction by 2. Or I can just drag this according to however I want. And if I want it to be a uniform scale, I can hold shift and press this, and I press 2, and then the entire object is scaled up by 2 along all 3 axes, right? Proportionally. So you can also do these things using commands. So if I want to move this, for example, I can use the move command, and I can select this object, and I select a point to move from, and then I can like move it, anywhere. But I can also just drag it using the gumball. And same for scaling. So I can scale 1-dimensionally, or 2-dimensionally, or 3-dimensionally. So essentially, everything that is done by the gumball can be achieved using the commands, but it's just easier to use the gumball. And another thing, the last thing that the gumball does is allow you to rotate. So I can rotate this box however I want, from the top, or if I want it to be slanted, I can move it like this. And again, if I want to key in a specific number or a specific angle that I want it to rotate from, then I can click on this rounded things and type in 45, then it will rotate. Or if I want it to rotate this way, I do 45 this way, or I can do -45. Same thing. Same thing applies. Okay, so that is Gumball. Another thing you can do is with Gumball is if, for example, I want to select a plane, right? Just a plane from this box. This box is a closed polysurface. So if I want to select a face, I can hold Control Shift and drag, and then I can just extend that one face. Okay, so it's Control Shift. I'm holding Control Shift and I'm just clicking the face, and then I can drag. I can even yeah, essentially do the same thing as to the entire object to one face. Okay, and then the next thing that I will cover is drawing. So basically Rhino, right, is like a 3D space. So if I'm drawing a polyline, there's no guarantee that I'm drawing this polyline on a flat plane. Okay, so right now it's a flat plane because why? I have this thing called project on. So when I untick project, it's possible that when I'm drawing, it may look like I'm drawing on a flat plane, but I'm actually not. Okay. Okay. Somehow it's still flat, but sometimes that happens because it's a 3D space that you're working with. So usually when I'm drawing in 2D on Rhino, I use the top view, obviously, and then I turn on project so that I know that I'm drawing flat. So if I draw this flat line, so the function I'm using now is polyline. So under this function, these are all standard. So I'm currently in like the NURBS interface, you know what I mean? So these are all standard tools. So there's lines, there's curves, and then you can draw circles with certain center and radius. So there's different ways of drawing circles. There's different types of lines. So you can draw an individual line, or you can draw a polyline using this command, right? Or you can draw a curve, and there's different ways of drawing a curve. So you can read essentially what each of them do. So if I want to create a curve, I can do this, and then I can even bring it up. So then my curve becomes 3D. Okay. So I'm going to untick project now. Okay, so I have this line drawn, right? And I want to extrude it upwards. So I can either use the command extrude curve, or I can just use Gumball to this little dot on Gumball to drag it up. So then I get this object. If I want to, again, I have a specific length that I want to extrude it by, I click this and I type in like 100. Then I get this height, an object with this height. Okay, and it's empty in the middle because it's not a closed plane. So I'm just extruding the curve. But if I want a closed solid form from this curve, what I will do is I will use this and I will type planar surface. So essentially there's a surface created from this curve, a flat surface, a planar surface, and then I can extrude this surface instead of the curve by 100. So now, right, I get a closed polysurface. If you see in the bar above, it's a closed polysurface. Previously, when I extruded the line, it's an open extrusion. So it's two different types of objects. And for instance, right, I have this planar surface created from this curve, and I don't want to keep the curve. I just want the surface, right? So I just use the command select curve. Then it will select curves, all the curves basically. So if I have like 10 different planes and there's different curves present in my super complicated model, and I want to select all the curves and delete them, I just use the command select curve, and then it will select the curves for me, and I'll just delete the curves. So I'm left with this one singular plane. Okay. And then there's also, things like point. So you can put a point on the thing, and then you can extrude the point to become a line, and then you can extrude the line to become a plane, and then you can extrude the plane to become a solid, right? Okay. So again, you can do the same thing with points. So select points, select point, and then I delete it. Okay. So the next few commands, right, are actually quite useful. So they're called Boolean commands. So all of these are under like the standard tools. So for instance, if I have this block and I am trying to subtract or add things to this block. So I'm just going to draw out a sphere and intersect the sphere with this block. Okay, then maybe I add another one. Make it bigger. Okay, so these Boolean commands, if I type Boolean in the command box, right, I have Boolean union. Okay, the most important ones. Boolean union. Wait, Boolean union. Boolean split is also an important one that you can look into. Boolean difference and Boolean intersection. So these four are important Boolean commands. So if I look into Boolean union, right, what Boolean union does is that it will make this entire entity one object. So now I have these three different objects, and I want to make this entire object one object, right? Okay, so if I want to select multiple, I can do this, or I can hold shift when I select so that I can select multiple. If I select this and then I don't hold shift, it will just select another object separately. But if I want to select everything, I hold shift and I select 1, 2, 3. And if I want to deselect one object, I can hold control and then click, and then I will deselect this one object. Or I can even use shift and control with the box. So for example, I'm holding control now and I want to deselect these two objects. So this is what I get. Okay, so that's for selection. So now Boolean union, right? So Boolean union will make these three objects one. So I type Boolean union, and then essentially what this bar thing does is that it tells you the instructions for each command. So now what I need to do is select surfaces or polysurfaces to union. So the three polysurfaces I'm going to select 1, 2, and 3. And then I just press enter. And now these three polysurfaces are one entity, right? So to undo, I'm doing a control Z. Then the next command is Boolean intersection. So again, it says select first set of polysurfaces. So I'm going to select the box first. And then it says select second set. So I'm going to select the spheres next. And then what this gives me is if I delete these two, and if I delete the box, the intersection of the spheres and the box is what I'm able to get from Boolean intersection. Okay, and then the last one I will cover is Boolean difference. So Boolean difference, again, select the first set. So I want to subtract from the box, and I press enter, and then I want to subtract with the spheres. So I select the two spheres and I press enter. So then now, if I delete the spheres, I get a box with the spheres subtracted. Okay? And I can also do the reverse where I want to subtract from the spheres. I want to subtract the box from the spheres. So instead of selecting the spheres first, or the box first, I select the spheres, and then I select the box, and then I get the spheres with the box subtracted from it. Okay? So these are pretty important commands. If I do a Boolean split, Boolean split, I want to split this box, and I want to use this as cutting surfaces. So again, I'll get this box with these pieces separated. Okay, so that's for Boolean commands. So hold on, yeah. Okay. Now I'm gonna go into parametric forms. Okay, so the first one that I mentioned, right, was NURBS, if you remember. So what I'm gonna cover under NURBS is lofting and also rebuilding. So if I have this plane, right? Okay, let me turn on project, and then I click plane from 3 or 4 corner points. So I'm building this plane. And this plane currently only has this one point, so I can only move it up and down, but I can't actually control the plane because the plane is uniform, correct? So if I rebuild and I select this plane, I can essentially create more of these subdivisions, or I shouldn't call them subdivisions, they are splines, which are called U and B. So if I increase the U count to 20, I'll basically get more lines across the U. And then if I increase this to 20, I'll get more lines across the thing. So I can basically control how much I want to rebuild, depending on how I want to control the plane. Okay, so I'm just going to keep it to 10 and 10 for now. Right? And then what I can do is turn on points. So points on, and then I select the object I want to turn the points on for. So now I have these splines and these points across the spline. So what I can do is I can actually control these points, right? I can pull them up and down, or I can select multiple. If I want this entire part to go up, I can pull it up, right? So now instead of this flat plane, I have already somewhat of a parametric form, right? So that's what rebuilding does, okay? So if, for example, I have a sphere, so go into here, and I make a sphere, and I rebuild the sphere, okay, 10, 10, okay? And then I turn points on. I can select one point and pull it or select multiple points and pull it. So it already starts to look like maybe potentially a potato, right? Instead of just a regular geometric sphere, right? Okay, so this is rebuild command. Another command that you can use is loft. So these are again under NURBS, right? So what NURBS does is that I'm using the geometry that you learned in exercise 1 and 2, which is like the basic geometry, you know, like spheres and stuff. And then I'm like modifying them so that they become organic or parametric, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw a bunch of different curves. Okay, so I turn on project and then I'm just going to draw in the top view this curve and then maybe another curve, or then I copy this curve and then I change a bit of it, or rotate it a bit, and then I have this. Okay, so I have these curves, right? They're all flat. And this could be like the sections of the potato that you cut, right? So then I'm gonna just drag them up by height, depending on how I want my potato to look like. Maybe I add one more and decrease the width. And then I add one more at the end, increase the width, right? So then I have this overall general section cuts of shape. So when I type the loft command, what loft does is that it connects one curve to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. So what I need to do is I need to select the curves, but in order of how I want the loft to be. So if I want this to connect to this, then followed by this, followed by this, followed by this, I have to click it in order. So when I click in order, it will basically show me a preview of the order. And this is what I will get. Okay, so if I want to close loft, usually I don't take close loft. If I want to close loft, I can take the option for close loft. And also sometimes when the curves don't align, you can click align curves and then you can like click on these points and they will align these curves differently. Okay, so now the curves are not aligned, right? So after I click these points, they are aligned. So I click OK, and then now I have this weird lofted shape from these circles that I've drawn. Okay, and then if I want to cap this, I can cap it. I can just type cap, I think. Yes. So now I have this closed polysurface that is, you know, a weird shape. And then again with this, right, I can rebuild. Or maybe I can't. Okay, I guess I can't. I can only rebuild these curves because this is already like an organic shape. But I think I can turn on points maybe. Okay, no, not for a polysurface. Okay, so then yeah, so I have this weird object that I can get from a loft. So there's these two commands, rebuild and loft, that I can get from NURBS surfaces. Okay, so if I go back to the slides, these two commands are under here. I'll send this deck of slides to the group chat later so then you can see how it looks like. So essentially, this is what NURBS is. So now I'm going to move on to mesh. Okay, so if I want to convert a NURBS to a mesh, if for example, I have this object, right, and I want to convert it to a mesh, all I need to do is click it and type mesh. And then I can select, like I mentioned before, right? If I choose fewer number of polygons, the shape won't be as defined. If I choose more polygons, the shape will be more defined, but then also the file will be very big. So I'm gonna go for a few polygons And then now I have this mesh underneath the actual object. So basically what it does is, like I mentioned before, the definition of mesh, it is a collection of uniform faces, right? So that's essentially what it has done to my NURBS surface. It's become these very small uniform faces, right? But the good part about this mesh now is that, okay, if I go to filter at the bottom and I take sub-objects, what I can do is I can select these individual faces and I can, okay, wait, give me a second. Okay, so what I can do is I can adjust these individual parts, which I can't do in the NURBS option, right? So I can select 4 of these things. So I'm holding shift to select multiple faces, and then I can pull to extrude. I can even select these curves, and I can pull to extrude, right? So then I get this very funky shape, but then I'm able to control exactly how I want it to look like. And if I, okay, I'm gonna untick sub-objects, and then if I do the same with more polygons, so if I mesh this, and I increase the number of polygons, I'll get something closer to the object itself. So I'm just gonna go back right now. So like this is a more accurate depiction of this object because there's more meshes to cover. But then also this is very big and it's very small spaces that I can control compared to this. Okay, so that is essentially what mesh is. And what you can do is you can directly model with mesh. You don't have to start with NURBS and then convert it to mesh. So there's this option called mesh tools, right? And then all the mesh tools are under here. So I'm gonna start off with, for example, a mesh box. So it will again instruct me exactly what I need to do. So the first corner of the base, and the X, Y, and Z count is 10, 10, 10. I can increase this amount or decrease it. So first corner of the base, other corner of the base, and then a height. If I have a specific height, I can key in a specific height like 20 or let's do 50. Or I can just click, right? So now I have this mesh box with all these little planes that I can now control if I click sub-objects in the selection filter. So I want to select all of this. And then I want to pull it, right? And then this face, all of it, I can even scale up and down using the Gumball. So I can scale this down, for example. And then do the same maybe with 4 little blocks here, pull it, and then scale it up like this. So I'm able to create these shapes because I can control the sub-objects, correct? So essentially, and then I'm also, okay, if I want to select the curves and bring it down or bring it out, I can also do that. Okay. So that is what mesh allows me to do. And then the difference between mesh and sub-D that I mentioned before is that mesh is made up of uniform faces and sub-D is not, right? Sub-D is made of non-uniform faces. So if I want to make this look more organic, then I can select this mesh object and convert it into a sub-D. So the command is to sub-D. So I'm just going to click yes. And then what I get is this very organic looking sub-D object from the mesh object. So again, in sub-D, right, if I tick sub-objects, I can actually select each face and pull it. Same thing as mesh, but just more organic because each plane has non-uniform splines, whereas this one is all uniform, right? So if I want to make this fatter a bit, pull it up, make it fatter. So this is how I can create inorganic shapes using sub-D. And if I want to create sub-D just from itself, again, I don't need a mesh to create a sub-D. I can use these sub-D tools. So for example, I can make like a sub-D sphere. And then I can select one surface and then start pulling it to adjust. And then it already kind of looks like what? A potato, right? Okay. So if I want to convert a sub-D back to a NURBS object, what I can do is to NURBS. And then I will have the same object, right? But with no subdivisions between it. So now I have this normal NURBS object with made up of like these planes. And if I want to convert a mesh, so if I want to convert this into a mesh, right? Mesh. Let's do an average number of polygons. I have this mesh. So now I have these three potatoes, right? NURBS, sub-D, and mesh. And I can also convert this mesh thing back to a NURBS. If I click to NURBS again, I can convert it back to a NURBS. So then this is now a NURBS object. Okay, so then now I have these three options for organic modeling. And essentially that's what I wanted to cover in the slides, which is from NURBS to mesh, I can use the mesh function. And then under NURBS, there's loft and rebuild. Under mesh, there's mesh tools, and each sub-object within the mesh can be adjusted if you turn on the filter and click sub-objects. And then mesh can be converted to a sub-D via to sub-D. And all of this, then mesh and sub-D can be converted to a NURBS, back to a NURBS. So you can work with these three tools, big tools, to model out whatever you need to model out for exercise 3. And keep in mind that all of these three tools have a lot more to them, but I just covered the general concept of them so that you can now delve in deeper into the tools that you do wish to use later on. Okay, so then after modeling, right? So I'm just gonna create these like random boxes to give examples. So after I model, if I wanna export these like as an image, what I can do is there's also other views, by the way, instead of just top, front, right, there's also like isometric. So if I click isometric and I click northeast, I'll get this view. And if I click isometric in another direction, I'll get another view from a different direction, right? So if I want to print this view of these three objects, I can just press Ctrl P or type print. And then I can select the paper size. And what I can do is I can also scale it under view and output scale. So I can scale to fit it so it fits on the piece of paper, or I can like use these scales to scale and fit this onto the piece of paper. So you need to know the size of your object and then how much you need to scale it in order for it to fit on the piece of paper. So right now I'm not really sure. So I'm just going to use a scale to fit, or okay, 1:5, or no, 1:5 is too small, right? So then yeah, 1:1 is also too small. So scale to fit lah, okay? And then I can just print it, and then it will save as a PDF to wherever I need it to be saved. And I can also do this in different modes. So if I want it to be in rendered mode, and there's a lot of options for these different display modes. So you can have it, for example, if I want my rendered mode to have lines, I can go to display properties. And then now I'm in the rendered mode, right? So I can add maybe surface edges. So then I have lines to define my object or stuff like that. So sub-D wires, sub-D creases, this is for sub-D objects. There's mesh objects. If I want to add curves and stuff, I can do it. If I go into further settings, edit rendered settings, this is display mode options, yeah? So I can go into shadows. I can adjust how the shadows look. I can turn off the shadows, or I can adjust the type of shadows or the color of the shadow. There's lots of things that you can do. This one you have to look into it yourself lah. There's too many things to cover. So again, I can Control P and then do the same thing where I adjust the scale according to the size of the paper. If I choose like A3, then I choose 1:50. I don't know, that's too small. 1:5, I don't know. Still too small. 1:2. Yeah. Okay. So you can do this and then you can export this as a PDF file. Another thing you can do is very important. Okay, so if I want to cut a section of this box, okay, how about I create the spheres again? Then you can see more clearly. So I'm gonna go into perspective view again. And then I'm gonna add this sphere. Okay, then I'm gonna Boolean difference. So I have this object, right? So from the top view, it looks like this. From the front, it looks like this. From the right, it looks like this. So if I want to make a 2D drawing of this, for example, the top view 2D drawing, I can just select this object and I type make 2D. So I will essentially just get a 2D drawing of this, which is great. And then I can assign these lines to different layers and then adjust the line type under here. So I can adjust line type and stuff and adjust the dimension of the lights and use line weights in Rhino itself. Or I can export this. So you can either adjust line weights in Rhino, which you can find out how to do yourself and adjust line types, or what people usually do is export to AI. So I select the lines that I want to export, and then I type export in the command section, and then I select Adobe Illustrator under the file type. So I type, okay, lines, and I save it to my desktop. And then I can choose the scale of whatever I want. And then I will get a scaled drawing, 2D drawing of my top view. Okay, so this is super useful. This is what we use to create drawings. But the problem with Make 2D is that if your object is extremely, extremely complicated, the lines won't be clean. So what you need to do is Make 2D and then clean one by one, which is kind of a hassle, but you know, sometimes you have to do what you have to do. That's why it takes so long, sometimes. So if I want to cut a section through this object, right, I'm gonna type clipping plane. And then this clipping plane, I'm gonna keep it flat, right? So here. So what this clipping plane is doing is cutting everything above this. And if I move it, you can see that it's cutting at different points. So if I adjust this clipping plane to the bottom of my object, and then I increase it by 1,000, by 10 mm. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm cutting this object 10 mm above the bottom. And then I can make 2D this view from the top view. So I go into top view and I make 2D. Right? So this is essentially I'm cutting a section. And if I want a different section, I can rotate this plane and pull it. So I'm getting a section from the right side. And then I can rotate to the left side and do the same. So I'm getting this section. So if I want to make 2D this section, I can go to the right view and then just make 2D. Okay, no, maybe it's the wrong direction. But yeah, you get the idea, right? That's what Make 2D does, and that's what Clipping Plane does, which is very important. And then you can export to AI. So essentially, after you make your model, you can export the drawings as well. Plan, section, elevation, same thing. Okay? Okay, so that's all that I'm gonna cover for today. Now I'm gonna open the floor to any questions, but I recommend that you guys try the software first.